Hey, what's up, YouTube? Let's take a look at the sky here in Boston today, huh? Let's look at this. This is a Nikon, so this should be really good footage. Let's take a look at those clouds, huh? Wow, those are really normal looking, aren't they? And it goes on. It's pretty much as far as you can possibly see. That is totally natural. Very, very natural diamond-shaped clouds that look like they're made entirely out of plasma.
You've all seen lots of articles on climate change, and here's yet another New York Times article, just like every other darn one you've seen. It says all the same stuff as all the other ones you've seen. It even has the same kind of headline as all the other ones you've seen. What's unusual about this one, maybe, is that it's from 1953. And the reason I'm saying this is that you may have the idea this problem is relatively recent, that people have just sort of figured out about it, and now with Kyoto and the 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗶𝗱𝗏 and people beginning to actually do something to solution. The fact is, We've known about this problem for 50 years, depending on how you count it, and we have talked about it endlessly over the last decade or so, and we've accomplished close to zip. This is the growth rate of CO2 in the atmosphere. You've seen this in various forms, but maybe you haven't seen this one. What this shows is that the rate of growth of our emissions is accelerating, and it's accelerating even faster than what we thought was the worst case just a few years back. So that red line there was something that a lot of skeptics said the environmentalists only put in the projections to make the projections look as bad as possible, that emissions would never grow as fast as that red line, but in fact they're growing faster. Here's some data from actually just 10 days ago, which shows this year's minimum of the Arctic sea ice, and it's the lowest by far. And the rate at which the Arctic sea ice is going away is a lot quicker than models. So despite all sorts of experts like me flying around the planet and burning jet fuel, and politicians signing treaties, in fact, you could argue the net effect of all this has been negative because it's just consumed a lot of jet fuel. In terms of what we, in terms of what we really need to do to put the brakes on this very high inertial thing, our big economy, we've really hardly started. Really, we're doing this, basically. Really not very much. I don't want to depress you too much. The problem is absolutely soluble, and even soluble in a way that's reasonably cheap, sort of the cost of the military, not the cost of medical care. Cheap meaning a few percent of GDP. This is really important to have this sense of scale. So the problem is soluble, and the way we should go about solving it is, say, dealing with electricity production, which causes something like 43% or so in rising of CO2 emissions, and we could do that by perfectly sensible things like conservation and wind power, nuclear power, and coal with CO2 capture, which are all things that are ready for giant scale deployment and work. All we lack is the action to actually spend the money to put those into place. Instead, we spend our time talking. But nevertheless, that's not what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is stuff that we might do if we did nothing. And it's this stuff in the middle here, which is what you do if you don't stop the emissions quickly enough, and you need to somehow break the link between human actions that change climate and the climate change itself. And that's particularly important because, of course, while we can adapt to climate change, and it's important to be honest here, there will be some benefits to climate change. Oh yes, I think it's bad. I spent my whole life working to stop it. But one of the reasons it's politically hard is there are winners and losers, not all losers. But of course, the natural world, polar bears, I've spent time skiing across the sea ice for weeks at a time in the high Arctic, they will completely lose, and there's no adaptation. So this problem is absolutely soluble. This geoengineering idea in its simplest form is basically the following. You could put fine particles, say sulfuric acid particles, sulfates, into the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, where they'd reflect away sunlight and cool the planet. And I know for certain that that will work. Not that there aren't side effects, but I know for certain that will work. And the reason is it's been done. And it was done not by us, not by me, but by nature. Here's 𝗦𝗵𝗿𝗏𝗿 in the early 90s that put a whole bunch of sulfur in the stratosphere with a sort of atomic bomb-like cloud, and the result of that was pretty dramatic. After that and some previous volcanoes we have, you see a quite dramatic cooling of the atmosphere. So this lower bar is the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, and it heats up after these volcanoes. But you'll notice that in the upper bar, which is the lower atmosphere on the surface, it cools down because we've shielded the atmosphere a little bit. There's no big mystery about it. There's lots of mystery in the details, and there's some bad side effects, like it partially destroys the ozone layer, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it clearly cools down. And one other thing, it's fast. It's really important to say. So a bunch of the other things that we ought to do, like slowing emissions, are intrinsically slow because it takes time to build all the hardware we need to reduce emissions. And not only that, when you cut emissions, you don't cut concentrations, because concentrations, the amount of CO2 in the air, is the sum of emissions over time. So you can't step on the brakes very quickly. But if you do this, it's quick. And there are times you might like to do something quick. Another thing you might wonder about is, does it work? Can you shade some sunlight and effectively compensate for the added CO2 and produce a climate sort of back to what it was originally? And the answer seems to be yes. So here's the graphs you've seen lots of times before. That's what the world looks like under one particular climate model's view, with twice the amount of CO2 in the air. The lower graph is with twice the amount of CO2 and 1.8% less sunlight, and you're back to the original climate. And this graph from 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗶𝗍, it's important to say came because Ken, at a meeting that I believe Marty Hoffert was also at in the mid-90s, Ken and I stood up at the back of the meeting and said, geoengineering won't work, and to the person who was promoting it said, the atmosphere is much more complicated, a bunch of physical reasons why it wouldn't do a very good compensation. Ken went and ran his models and found that it did. This topic is also old. That report that landed in President Johnson's desk when I was 2 years old, 1965, that report, in fact, which had all the modern climate science, the only thing they talked about doing was geoengineering. It didn't even talk about cutting emissions, which is an incredible shift in our thinking about this problem. I'm not saying we shouldn't cut emissions, we should, but it made exactly this point. So in a sense, there's not much new. The one new thing is this essay. So I should say, I guess, that since the time of that original President Johnson report and the various reports of the US National Academy, 1977, 1982, 1990, people always talked about this idea, not as something that was foolproof, but as an idea to think about. But when climate became politically a hot topic, if I may make the pun, in the last 15 years, this became so un-PC we couldn't talk about it. It just sunk below the surface. We weren't allowed to speak about it. But in the last year, Paul Crutzen published this essay saying roughly what's all been said before, that maybe given our very slow rate of progress in solving this problem and the uncertain impacts, we should think about things like this. He said roughly what's been said before. The big deal was he happened to have won the Nobel Prize for ozone chemistry, and so people took him seriously when he said we should think about this, even though there will be some ozone impacts, and in fact he had some ideas to make them go away. There was all sorts of press coverage all over the world, going right down to Dr. Strangelove Saves the Earth from The Economist. And that got me thinking. I've worked on this topic on and off, but not so much technically. And I was actually lying in bed thinking one night, and I thought about this child's toy, which is hence the title of my talk. And I wondered if you could use the same physics that makes that thing spin around in the child's radiometer to levitate particles into the upper atmosphere and make them stay there. One of the problems with sulfates is they fall out quickly. The other problem is they're right in the ozone layer, and I prefer them above the ozone layer. And it turns out, I woke up the next morning and I started to calculate this, and it was very hard to calculate from first principles. I was stumped. But then it found out that there were all sorts of papers already published that address this topic because it happens already in the natural atmosphere. So it seems there are already fine particles that are levitated up to what we call the mesosphere, about 100 kilometers up, that already have this effect. I'll tell you very quickly how the effect works. There are a lot of fun complexities I'd love to spend the whole evening on, but I won't. But let's say you have sunlight hitting some particle and it's unevenly heated. So the side facing the sun is warmer, the side away cooler. Gas molecules that bounce off the warm side bounce away with some extra velocity because it's warm, and so you see a net force away from the sun. That's called the photophoretic force. There are a bunch of other versions of it that I and some collaborators have thought about how to exploit, and of course we may be wrong. This hasn't all been peer-reviewed. We're in the middle of thinking about it, but so far it seems good. But it looks like we could achieve long atmospheric lifetimes, much longer than before, because they're levitated. We could move things out of the stratosphere into the mesosphere, in principle solving the ozone problem. I'm sure there will be other problems that arise. And finally, we could make the particles migrate to over the poles, so we could arrange the climate engineering so it really focused on the poles, which would have minimal bad impacts in the middle of the planet where we live, and do the maximum job of what we might need to do, which is cooling the poles in case of planetary emergency, if you like. This is a new idea that's crept up that may be essentially a cleverer idea than putting sulfates in. whether this idea is right or some other idea is right, I think it's almost certain that we will eventually think of cleverer things to do than just putting sulfur in. That if engineers and scientists really turn their minds to this, it's amazing how we can affect the planet. The one thing about this is it gives us extraordinary leverage. This improved science and engineering will, whether we like it or not, give us more and more leverage to affect the planet, to control the planet, to give us weather and climate control, not because we plan it, not because we want it, just because science delivers it to us bit by bit, with better knowledge of the way the system works and better engineering tools to affect it. Now suppose that space aliens arrived on, maybe they're going to land at the UN headquarters down the road here, or maybe they'll pick a smarter spot. But suppose they arrive and they give you a box, and the box has two knobs. One knob is the knob for controlling global temperature, maybe another knob is a knob for controlling CO2 concentrations. You might imagine that we would fight wars over that box, because we have no way to agree about where to set the knobs. We have no global governance, and different people will have different places they want it set. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. It's not very likely. But we're building that box. The scientists and engineers of the world are building it piece by piece in their labs, even when they're doing it for other reasons, even when they're thinking they're just working on protecting the environment. They have no interest in crazy ideas like engineering the whole planet. They develop science that makes it easier and easier to do. And so I guess my view on this is not that I want to do it, I do not, but that we should move this out of the shadows and talk about it seriously, because sooner or later we'll be confronted with decisions about this, and it's better if we think hard about it, even if we want to think hard about reasons why we should never do it.
One aspect of the climate problem that people sometimes don't appreciate is the timescale. The fact that a large fraction of the carbon we're putting in the atmosphere will still be there thousands, even tens of thousands of years from now. But another part of the timescale of climate change is the timescale of the energy systems on which our society is built. Switching our energy system from a fossil fuel-based one like it is today to a non-fossil energy system would take, at the very least, many, many decades, and probably much more than a century, and tens of trillions of dollars, and that's just for the US alone. The numbers are just staggering. Many of us who have looked at the energy systems of the world and the climate system have a feeling that we may actually not be able to switch our energy system over in time to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And this is really why solar geoengineering, I think, is an important thing to look at very carefully.
Solar geoengineering refers to a set of technologies that could allow humanity to deliberately increase the planet's reflectivity, reflecting away some sunlight, and so partially offsetting the temperature changes and other climate changes that come from the accumulation of carbon dioxide. This is not a substitute for cutting emissions. If we want a stable climate, in the end, we must bring emissions to zero. But it is a powerful supplement. It could reduce the risks of climate change in ways that we cannot reduce them by simply cutting emissions. It could allow us to reduce temperature extremes that cause real human suffering, deaths from heat waves, losses of crops that will cause real damage in the poorest parts of the world. It reduces the extreme precipitation events. These are the big storms that are some of the most dangerous things about climate change. So the benefits of solar geoengineering in the form of reduced climate risk, reduced crop loss, reduced sea level rise, might amount to something like 1% of global GDP. And surprisingly, solar geoengineering can be very inexpensive. The cost might be something like $10 billion for the whole planet. That sounds like a lot of money each year, but in fact that's something like 1/10,000th of global GDP. So the benefits might be 1,000 times larger than the costs, which is just stunning. And that's why we need a research program.
It turns out there is no government funding at the moment for solar geoengineering, practically none. We have the National Academy of Sciences recommending to proceed with research on solar geoengineering. NGOs, Environmental Defense Fund, where I just spent the better part of a decade, is recommending careful research as well. And none of it is happening.
One of the reasons that people are so hesitant to have solar geoengineering is they think that that will lead us to do less in terms of curbing greenhouse gases. Countries have not been very aggressive in stepping forward in controlling these greenhouse gases. But let's assume that I even thought that this would affect things 1% in terms of the greenhouse gases that were reduced, I would still go ahead with solar geoengineering because I think that we're on a very unpleasant course and we have to do something about it. Solar geoengineering is the most promising technology that we have today.
Solar geoengineering as a public problem brings together many of the ingredients that brought me into the research world in the first place. I'm interested in environmental problems because they're a site of innovation. They're a place where society comes to grips with the fact that we're not human beings alone. We live in a planet that has an environment and we're integrated into it. So here we have one of the most urgent environmental problems confronting humanity, and we're saying that 190 plus countries, we are going to do a set of technologies that will alter the planet in order to make it safer. But we have not devoted attention to the institutional structures that are now needed in order to respond to the challenges. We have to have global buy-in.
One of the main reasons that it's critical to start this research right now is that there are risks that are associated with the introduction of aerosols in the stratosphere. The risks are well known for sulfates aerosols as they exist naturally in the atmosphere and they get into the stratosphere from volcanic eruptions. These aerosols are known to have the potential to deplete ozone and change the temperature of the stratosphere, which has a number of effects. Because of these risks that we know about, we're very interested in exploring new materials and have the potential to greatly decrease these risks compared to sulfate. There's a number of materials that people have thought about, such as diamonds or calcite, but as these are new materials for the stratosphere, we actually don't really know their reactivity. Hence, it is critical that we conduct experiments. We need to find out and try to quantify aspects as soon as possible. Because the worst scenario we want to be in is that in 10, 20 years down the road, we find ourselves in a situation where we say the rate of change from climate change is so big that the cost to humans and the environment is unacceptable, and we are starting to be forced in a situation to do something to try and slow the rate of change. And the last situation we want to be in is to then make an uninformed decision and have wasted 20 years or 10 years or whatever time of potential to try and do research and get to a better understanding and a better quantification of risk, and also have more time to actually try and look for the ideal material to do this.
To me, solar geoengineering is terrifying. We're talking about an engineering project that would affect every living thing on this planet. The possibility that something could go wrong is really scary. And of course, the question of who controls it and to what level do you actually set the thermostat? These are very deep, fundamental questions, and we don't have answers to them. And yet, as scary as that is, as uncertain as some of the impacts of solar geoengineering may be, I think the evidence is clearer and clearer that not doing solar geoengineering and letting climate change proceed may be actually worse as an alternative. And therefore, I think we have to take a very hard look at solar geoengineering and its use in the future.
Solar geoengineering doesn't get us out of the need to cut emissions. In the end, if we want a stable, safe climate, we have to bring global emissions to zero. But the combination of solar geoengineering and emissions cuts can get us climate benefits that you can't get with emissions cuts alone. Whatever your views, our children will face decisions about what to do with climate risk, decisions that will inevitably involve the possibility of doing solar geoengineering. If we have no research program, then what we give them is the gift of ignorance. We need a diverse, systematic effort to figure out how solar geoengineering might work. That effort should be non-commercial, open access, and it must be international. Moreover, this is a problem where a multidisciplinary approach is absolutely vital. We need engineering and science, but unless it's embedded in a larger universe that thinks about governance, thinks about business, thinks about ethics, and even the way this fits in our environmental literature, we won't be able to do something that really helps the world ultimately make decisions about it. We need a research program that thinks about how to reduce the technical risks by figuring out better science and technology, and how to build institutions that have a better chance of governing a technology like this in a divided world.